In this part, we're going to be focusing on the Ottoman Empire and how it's going to be divided so that most of the empire will be split up into different countries or colonies, while the center of the Ottoman Empire, the modern-day nation-state of Turkey, will come into existence as a modern independent nation-state. And just as a reminder, we'd been talking about how at one time the Ottoman Empire was extraordinarily powerful, and you can see that here is the Ottoman Empire at its height. Look at all that territory it controls, right? Much of North Africa, much of the modern-day Middle East. It controls, of course, what will become Turkey, Greece, the birthplace of Western democracy, as well as a large part of the Balkans of southeastern Europe. So this was once a powerful, mighty empire. Remember, it was an Islamic empire, identified as Sunni Empire, and the Ottoman Sultan, basically the Ottoman Emperor, claimed to be the Caliph, the successor of Muhammad. And they were so powerful, they were able to take this large section of southeastern Europe. They threatened Vienna, though they were never actually able to take it. And of course, they took Constantinople, renamed it Istanbul, and took what had been the largest Christian church at the time and converted it into a mosque. So this was a very powerful empire, but we're going to be looking at how it will have gone into decline and then be divided up. Now again, this is going way back, but you might recall that one thing we emphasized about the Ottoman Empire was, for the most part, it was pretty tolerant. With the exception of the Janissaries, so long as Jews and Christians were willing to pay the tax, they were able to keep their religion. So the Ottoman Empire for the time period was relatively tolerant, right? It was able to tolerate ethnic and religious minorities as long as they showed that they were loyal. One way, of course, you showed you were loyal was by paying the tax. And that was based on this Islam being, in a sense, the ruling orthodoxy, the ruling ideology of the Ottoman Empire. However, there's going to be a change. There's going to be the rise of Turkish nationalism in the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Turks are the center, the core of the empire. The sultans are Turks. And they, Turkish people who make up the Ottoman Empire, along with all these other people, these Turks will develop a rising sense of nationalism. So they will tend to emphasize more and more their distinctive Turkish ethnic identity, right? They're going to focus more and more on that identity as opposed to the old Islamic ones. I'm not saying they stopped being Muslims, but that became less important in terms of how they saw the world. They tended to more increasingly emphasize nationalism, particularly Turkish nationalism. And you'll remember that in order, as nationalism is this idea that, each nation should have its own state. The state is supposed to be protector of the nation. The nation is your first and primary loyalty. And also there's this idea that nationalism needs people to work together for national power, right? If you want your nation state to be strong, people need to be unified behind that nation state. That needs to be their primary loyalty. So these ideas are growing in the Ottoman Empire and are replacing some of those old ideas which center identity on religion. So there were and are minority peoples in modern-day Turkey, in this region, and one group of people were the Armenians, right? One group of people were the Armenians. The Armenians have a fascinating history. One thing that we should know, if you read the New Testament, sometimes Jesus will speak in Aramaic, and the gospel will say, like, this has been translated from Aramaic, and that's the language of the Armenians. And Armenia was actually the first kingdom to actually accept Christianity as its official state religion. So Armenia has an important history, and there is Armenians are a ethnic group that have their own language, their own culture, and they tend to practice Orthodox Christianity, so kind of Christianity similar to what is practiced, for example, in Russia. And these people, as Christians, had lived long under the Ottoman rule. They didn't always like it, but they were willing to pay the tax to keep their religion, and were, for the most part, especially in the earlier period before nationalism, were tolerated in the Ottoman Empire. So the Armenians were this group of people that were an ethnic minority and a kind of religious minority. They had their own language and religion that was different from the Turks. The Turks were principally Muslims. The Armenians are principally Christians. And with the rise of nationalism, there's this sense that we can no longer tolerate these people, right? Under the old system of Islam, as long as they paid their taxes and were loyal, well, they're okay. We can accept them and let them be. We can tolerate them. But with the rise of nationalism, Turks tend to emphasize more and more their differences with these Armenians. And some Armenians would, of course, like to have their own nation state as well. So the Turks grow increasingly distrustful of Armenians. They say these Armenians are dangerous. We're not sure if they will be loyal. They're different from us. And so what's fascinating to me in a sad kind of way is that the new secular ideals of nationalism turn out to be much more intolerant than the old religious ideal of Islam. Right? In Islam, Armenians were tolerated as long as they paid their tax. But now, under the growing secular ideology of nationalism, there's this growing distrust of Armenians. Oh, we don't know if we can trust these people. They have their own language and their own religion. And it's not so important, the fact that they're a different religion. That's not the religion part that's important. The important part is the different part, right? These people are different from us. We don't know if we can trust them. So there will be an increasing amount of pressure and oppression and even massacres of Armenian people of the Armenian ethnicity by people who are Turkish. And during World War I, wartime conditions are naturally chaotic. People die all the time during war. And what will happen is the wartime conditions will allow the Turkish government to order the movement of Armenians. Armenia is very close to the Russian Empire, and the Russians were the enemy of the Ottoman Empire during World War I and encouraged the Christian subjects, including the Armenians, to rise up in rebellion against the Turkish government. And a few Armenians did support the Russians against the Ottoman Empire. So using this as an excuse, using this as a justification, the Turkish government will order the movement of Armenians away from the territory that is close to Russia, and a large number of them will die. One estimate I've heard is 1.5 million Armenians will die, either because when they're forced to move, no provisions are really made for them. No one is supplying them food or water, right? So you're forced to leave your home and move somewhere else, often through a very hostile environment, and you're not given any food or water, you're going to die. And in other cases, the Turkish government officials, soldiers would just straight out massacre Armenians, right? This was a good way to get rid of this minority that the Turks didn't know if they could trust, right? We're switching over to this ideology of nationalism. It can make our country very powerful, can make our country very strong. But in order to do that, we need everyone to be unified. Oh, these Armenians are different. They won't unify with us. We don't trust them. So we need to eliminate them. And I want to stress, this is often considered the 20th century's first genocide, because notice, the Armenians are being targeted because of their ethnicity, right? So it's not like they just arrested or executed those Armenians who actually rebelled or who were actually working against the Turkish government. And it's my understanding that there were a few who did that. They just went after anyone who was Armenian. So the key thing is you're being targeted not because you did anything, but because you're the wrong ethnicity, right? And like I say, a huge number of people will die from this, and this includes women and children, right? The whole idea is to eliminate these people as an identifiable ethnic group. Some women will survive, but they're forced to marry Turks, and then will disappear in terms of, they won't disappear physically, they'll still be there, but they'll eventually lose, in a sense, over generations, their Armenian kind of identity. And what's really striking about this is Adolf Hitler, just before he invades the Soviet Union, and as we'll talk about later, this involves the massacre of Jews and other people that the Nazis don't like, he has said, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" And what he means about that is that during war, you can kill off a minority that you don't like, and people won't notice because there's a wartime situation. And even if people do notice, they will eventually forget, right? They will eventually forget. So this was the Armenian genocide, the slaughter of all these Armenians, will eventually, in a sense, inspire Adolf Hitler to try and do the same thing to Jewish people and other people he doesn't like. Now, one thing I want to stress, not all Armenians die. They are still around, and there is an independent country now of Armenia. But there was this very serious attempt to get rid of them, right, under this secular ideology of nationalism. And I think that's important to emphasize. People often will say, well, religion is inherently violent, whereas secular ideologies are not. And I think it's hard to argue that after studying 20th century history and all the genocides and things that oftentimes, as we'll see, even if they talk about religion, religion isn't center. What's center is more ethnicity or race. And that's, again, what was really kind of at the center here, was not so much that the Armenians were Christian. That was just one other thing that was different about them. It was just that they were different. Right? They don't belong to the majority, so we don't know if we can trust them, so we got to get rid of them. Now, you may recall, of course, that Turkey picked the losing side of World War I. They were on the side of the Central Powers. They fought on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain and France and Russia. And so since they lost, their empire is going to be split up. The Ottoman Empire will be cut down, will be separated, and will essentially morph into Turkey. Between the years 1920 and 23, this new country of Turkey will really be fighting for its survival. There will be civil wars in Turkey and foreign wars over territory that Turkey claims, but other countries also claim. However, Turkey will hold together thanks to the victories of a man named Mustafa Kemal, who will take the name Ataturk, which means father of the Turks. Right? So Turkey will be able to survive being cut down to a much smaller country than the Ottoman Empire was. It will survive civil and foreign wars, thanks to the brilliant leadership of this man Ataturk, and it can now be transformed into a modern nation state. Right? Ataturk will be able to hold this country together through war. Once it has peace, it can concentrate into becoming a modern nation state. And you can see there on the right, Ataturk, and you can see he's dressed very much as a military man, which makes sense because that's how his career basically started. He was a soldier primarily who will eventually become a civilian leader. What I think is particularly fascinating is when he does try and make a modern nation state, he decides that he wants to make a secular state, a non-religious state. Right? So even though, and this is what I was saying earlier about religion becoming less important, right? Mustafa Kemal was a Muslim, but he wanted to make a state that was secular, that was essentially separated from religion as a ruling ideology. He's going to look in particular to France, actually, as an inspiration, as it was, in many ways, a secular state. And as part of this, he's going to get rid of Islamic law. You may have heard of Sharia law that helped govern the Ottoman Empire. He says, nope, not anymore. We're going to have modern law, and he will, in fact, base his government's law code on the French's law code, which of course is based on that of Napoleon. He will also get rid of the caliphate. Until this time period, the Ottoman Empire and then later Turkey had claimed to have the caliphs, the successors to Muhammad, and Mustafa Kemal gets rid of it. Ataturk gets rid of it, says we're not going to have the caliphate anymore. And this is a huge deal because after this, there hasn't been any one caliph that the majority of Muslims have accepted in the world, right? So it's kind of fascinating in a sense, and this is one reason why sometimes there's some kind of division in the Islamic world, is there's no more caliph, right? And this is why ISIS was able to get some support, because they claimed that they were restoring the caliphate, right? They claimed to be restoring the caliphate, that their leader was the successor of Muhammad. Well, that is made possible because Ataturk got rid of the caliphate. Says, nope, not a thing we're going to do anymore. The government he establishes is a republic, the one with a powerful president, so he is basically able to rule as a dictator, and the presidents tend to be powerful, but there is a democratic tradition as well within Turkey. And one thing I think that's fascinating is that women will get the right to vote and to be elected. So he's really trying to form a modern secular government. What I think is particularly fascinating too, if you look on, that's Ataturk there in a suit, and you can see that he is looking at a chalkboard, and it has what look like Roman letters on it. And they are Roman letters. And this is fascinating because before this time period, Turks, when they wrote their language, they wrote it in using Arabic letters, right? They wrote it using Arabic letters. So they used Turkish sounds, but Arabic letters to represent those sounds, right? So they were using Arabic not to write in Arabic, but to write in Turkish, if that makes sense. But after this time period, after the Ottoman Empire, Ataturk will have them switch to using an alphabet based on the Roman alphabet, not the Arabic alphabet. So it shows his idea of shifting away from the Islamic world, away from Islam, towards Europe, which is becoming increasingly secular. All that being said, though, I want to emphasize that the Ottoman Empire is going to be cut down, in a sense, just to Turkey. So what's going to happen to the rest of the territory? And here's what happens to the rest of the territory, right? You can see Turkey labeled there. Countries like Egypt would become nominally independent. Egypt's kind of complex because it's basically like a semi-colony. But you can see there that a large part of the territory, some of the most valuable parts of the territory, will be divided into Syria, Transjordan, and Iraq, which you may know today, these basically roughly are equivalent to 4 nations today: Israel, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. And you may say, well, what's a mandate? And what do we mean by that? Well, these don't become independent countries in this time period, right? They're independent countries now. But in this time period, they're divided. Syria will go to the French. Palestine, which will become kind of the nucleus of the modern nation state of Israel, will go to the British, as will Transjordan, which becomes Jordan, as well as Iraq. Those will all fall under British mandates. What's a mandate, you may ask? It is basically a colony. Basically, the League of Nations gave rule of these areas over to France and Britain in order to tutor them, to help them, to prepare them for independence. And if they did a bad job, theoretically, the League of Nations could take these mandates away. However, for all practical purposes, these were colonies. Right? You may remember we had this idea of the self-determination of nations, but this only applied to the colonies of the losers. The Ottoman Empire lost, so the Ottoman Empire gets divided up. But in this case, Syria, Transjordan, and Iraq were considered strategically important. They had valuable resources like oil. So rather than being given their independence, they are instead going to be given essentially as colonies to France and Britain since they won the war. The Great War had an interesting impact on empires. Some empires, like the Ottoman Empire, are going to be divided up. Other empires, like the British Empire, will expand. As we just discussed, the British Empire got control over former Ottoman territories, specifically Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan. What, though, about Britain's old empire? What about Britain's old empire? And we're going to to answer that kind of question, we're going to look at India. Now, just as a reminder, remember, national self-determination does not apply to victors' colonies. So India does not get to be independent as a result of World War I, like other places were. At the same time, though, there is a growing sense of Indian identity and nationalism. Remember how we talked about before, as the British gained power in India, one thing that was key to them gaining power was that Indians were often divided. Right? Indians from different regions didn't have a shared Indian identity, and so were willing to work with the British against other Indians. But increasingly, Indians are developing a shared sense of Indian identity that transcends region. So they're developing this kind of, they're starting to follow this idea of nationalism, right? There is this Indian identity, and we Indians should have our own nation state ruled by Indians. And what's key is, remember, the British had this understanding of civilization as being related to democracy, to liberalism. So they have to allow Indians some freedom. So Indians can discuss these ideas. Indians can talk about a developing Indian identity. They can talk about one day becoming independent of the British Empire. That's fine as long as it's within certain limits, right? So the Indians have an experience under the British of having some freedom. Freedom to the extent that they're even able to question the British Empire, and think of a future and talk about a future in which India is independent. Now, as part of this, Indians are therefore willing to support Britain during World War I. As we saw in the other section, previous section, Indians were fighting on behalf of the British Empire during World War I. So they expect to be rewarded, right? We Indians literally fought, bled, and died for the British Empire. So we have proven our loyalty to the empire. We have sacrificed for the empire. It is only right and just that we be rewarded by the empire. So we Indians should receive greater political rights. We should receive greater freedoms because, after all, haven't we proved our loyalty? However, rather than doing this, the British government is going to increase control. It's going to increase government control in India and withdraw a lot of the freedoms that Indians previously enjoyed. For example, the British will start censoring newspapers more than they had in the past. So you have a kind of dangerous situation, right? The Indians are wanting more rights, and the British are wanting them to have less rights. Indians are demanding more freedom. The British want them to have less freedom. So that will obviously lead to conflict. And to give you an example of this conflict, the picture there on the right is in the city of Amritsar, which is holy to Sikhs, a religion we mentioned in passing previously. There will be a protest there, and the British military unit, led by a British official but with soldiers that are mostly Indian, will actually fire on an Indian crowd. Right, so Indians will protest against the British, say, why aren't you allowing us our freedoms? We've proved our loyalty. And the British will respond with violent repression. Right, with violent repression. So there's this question then, how should Indians react? Some Indians say, well, if the British are going to be violent, we should be violent back. And some Indians will actually assassinate British government officials. Right, if the British are going to kill us, if the British are going to use violence to suppress us, we will kill the British. We will use violence to resist them. However, the dominant strain of resistance against the British will be that follows the teachings of a man named Mohandas Gandhi. Right? Mohandas Gandhi is in many ways a fascinating person, but one thing I want to emphasize first is that he was trained as a Western educated lawyer. Right? So he was Indian, but he learned flawless English, and he also received a Western education, studied British law, and became a lawyer. So he understood Western ideas quite well, ideas of liberalism and democracy and so forth, and he wanted to see them in India. Now, what I think is also fascinating is if you look at that picture of Mohandas Gandhi, is you will notice that he is not dressed like a Western educated lawyer. Western educated lawyers, especially this time, wore a lot of clothes. He's wearing almost no clothes. That is on purpose. He is dressed as a traditional Hindu holy man would have dressed. And that may be a little surprising. Normally we think of religious people wearing lots of clothes, not very little clothing. But in Hinduism, the idea is that a religious person, a holy person, should not be interested in material goods and shows their lack of interest in material goods by foregoing clothing. Right, and not wearing a lot of clothing can be very uncomfortable, right? You don't have anything to protect you from the heat, from the cold, and so forth. So he is following the image of a traditional Hindu holy man in order to try and win support. And I want to stress that is support from the wider population. Right? During this time period, there was something called the Indian National Congress. And the Indian National Congress was basically a political kind of debating society where different Indian politicians would come together to discuss politics and possible independence and autonomy and so forth. But it was mostly a club for highly educated people. However, most Indians were not highly educated. In fact, a lot of Indians could not read and write. And so they wouldn't have been able to understand a lot of these ideas that were being discussed. And certainly could not have read about those ideas. And Gandhi realized that a small group of Western educated Indians was probably not going to have a big effect. They weren't going to really be able to change things on their own. They needed to link up with the population of India. They need to figure out a way to gather the power of the Indian people. And you couldn't do that simply by relying on Western ideas on their own, because they wouldn't have made sense to most Indian people, because they didn't receive a Western style education. So Gandhi will present himself as a holy man, and that will give him a kind of hearing, and using that kind of terminology, using traditional Indian ideas mixed with his own understanding of liberalism and nationalism and so forth, he will call for Indian independence. And he will transform the Indian National Congress, which, like I said, had been this kind of club for wealthy elite people. He is going to kind of transform that into a mass party, into a political party which includes a huge number of people. And his ideas will emphasize a kind of spread of nationalism. That mass party will be a great way of spreading nationalism, and it focuses on, it's essentially anti-British. We want to get the British out, right? In order for our nation state to exist, in order for Indians to rule Indians, we need to kick the British out, right? It's not a kind of racism, but it's the idea that we shouldn't have these British people ruling Indians. Indians should rule Indians. And remember, we talked about in a previous section about the famine that struck India in the 1870s. We can kind of understand why. They would want to be able to govern things themselves. Now, Gandhi is really fascinating because he's going to argue that key to getting rid of the British is not violence. He thinks violence is wrong. Key is civil disobedience and active resistance, but active nonviolent resistance. So let me give you an example. You'll see in that picture that Gandhi is making cloth, right? Gandhi's making cloth. You also may recall how Indians had originally sold cloth to the British, but are now in a position where they're selling cotton to the British. The British are making it into cloth and selling back to the Indians. Gandhi argues essentially two things about that. He's saying, look, because we've become dependent on British cloth, and that allows the British to control us. And also because we're dependent on British cloth, the British are making a huge amount of money off of us. So if we were to stop buying British cloth, we could assert our independence, our self-reliance, and if the British don't make money anymore, they'll leave India. Right? The British essentially are in India. I mean, that's what got them there in the first place, to make money, to extract resources. And if they can't do that anymore, then they'll leave. Right? So we need to boycott. We need to stop buying British cloth. We need to make our own. And then the British won't be able to make money. They will leave. And Gandhi, even when he became a very powerful leader who, leaders are very busy, would spend several hours a day making cloth to show his deep belief in this idea. In addition, he also argued for non-cooperation. If there was a law that the Indians thought was wrong, they should just not follow the law. If there was the British need Indians to help govern, well, if Indians refuse to help, the British cannot govern India, right? So through boycotts, through not working with the British government to help govern India, through disobeying what are seen as unjust laws, the British will find that they can no longer make a profit in India and will therefore leave. That's his basic idea, and then India can become a nation state. So to give you an example of one of these campaigns of non-cooperation, of active resistance that is nonviolent, we're going to look at the Salt March. So there was an argument, in a sense, among the elite Indians over what they should do, how they should respond to the British attempts to develop their control over India, to expand control when Indians wanted independence. And Gandhi wanted to march the sea to collect salt. And this is going to happen in 1930. Right? He wants to march the sea to collect salt. What had happened was the British made it illegal to collect salt. Right? You can't go to the sea and make salt. You could theoretically do this, and a lot of Indians did do this. They just took seawater and boiled it to get the salt. That is now illegal. You have to buy salt. And the British had put a big tax on salt, so they can make a lot of money now, right? So they force people to stop making salt, so people have to buy salt. And if you buy salt, you got to pay the British a tax. And so Gandhi wanted to challenge that law. Now, a lot of intellectuals were kind of questioning this. We're saying, why do you want to deal with this law, Gandhi? Why not focus on the land tax? for example? Why do you want to focus on the salt tax? And Gandhi's logic was very good. Very few Indians actually owned much land, and the people who did own land could afford to pay the land tax. But one thing, if you're very poor, you don't have much money, and you're going to spend a lot of your money on just the basic necessities for survival, things like food, things like shelter, and things like salt. And to many Indians, right, especially the poor masses, remember Gandhi wants to form a mass movement. He wants to harness the power. He's a nationalist after all. He wants to harness the power of the people. He wants to find an issue they care about and that they can understand. If you focus on a land tax, which only focuses on a small group of people, it doesn't really help you. But if you focus on an issue that impacts most Indians, especially the poor, then they're going to agree with you and support you. So because of this, Gandhi will be successful in leading several 100,000 Indians on a march to go make salt. And it's very difficult for the British to do anything about this. You can't justify shooting people because they're going to make salt. I mean, it is a crime, but it's not a capital crime. You can't just kill people because they want to make salt. And you certainly can't imprison hundreds of thousands of people. And Gandhi is savvy. He knows that, even though there's this attempt to restrict freedom in India, Britain is still a country of liberty, of democracy. British people will see this. This will be reported on. People will take pictures of it. British people will know about this, and as well as people outside of Britain. And this will look really good on an international stage. These Indians, rather than be, if they use violence, you could just dismiss them as kind of thugs or criminals. But because they're acting following peaceful means, it makes them appear very noble and very dignified. This leads to massive pressure on the British from within their empire, from within Britain, but also the entire world, to change the policy. And in the end, it works. The tax is dropped. Now you may ask, why is that such a big deal? It inspires Indians. They see that if they're united, if they can work together, they can get independence for their country. Right? And that peaceful means can work. If they're united, they're able to work together to make an independent country and later a powerful nation state. Now, as this is a world history class, one thing I want to point out is how Gandhi was influenced and influenced others. So an early 19th century American philosopher is a man named Henry David Thoreau, right? And you can see a nice quote from him: "Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is in prison." And Henry David Thoreau emphasized civil disobedience, that if a law was unjust, you should break it. You should be willing to go to jail for breaking it. You should not resist violently, however. And Thoreau was inspired in part by the teachings of Jesus, developed them into kind of his own philosophy, and then his philosophy influenced Gandhi. So Gandhi was influenced by Americans like Thoreau, and of course through Thoreau, through this ancient religious teacher, Jesus. And Gandhi's ideas would flow back the other way. You may have heard of Benjamin Mays, a native of Greenwood County. He met Gandhi and was influenced by Gandhi's ideas and helped try to apply them to the situation faced by African Americans. Right? How can we use civil disobedience? How can we use this kind of non-cooperation, boycotts, or whatever? How can we use these peaceful means of active resistance, nonviolent means of active resistance? How can we use these to address the oppression of African Americans? How can we use these to make sure that African Americans get their rights? Right? Benjamin Mays, a Greenwood native, like I said, Greenwood County, is going to be influenced by Gandhi and try and apply them to the situation he faces and the other African Americans face. And Benjamin Mays will become president of Morehouse College in Georgia, which is where Martin Luther King is going to go to get his PhD, and Mays will actually act as his dissertation advisor. So King will be influenced by Mays in terms of ideas of civil disobedience being used to challenge oppressive governments. And of course, Mays was impacted by Gandhi as well as Jesus. Mays was a minister, a Baptist minister. And of course, Gandhi was himself impacted by Henry David Thoreau, an American philosopher, as well as Jesus. So it's this very interesting kind of global connections we see here, which is one thing I love about teaching world history. However, there is a problem with developing a truly united India. Now, Gandhi, even though he dressed as a Hindu holy man, was himself a believer in an India in which Indians of any religion, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Sikh, any religion, could live together at peace, that all would have their religions tolerated. In fact, what is striking is Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu who thought he was being too nice to Muslims. Right? Gandhi, though he himself was a Hindu, was assassinated by a Hindu who thought that Gandhi was being too nice to Muslims. So as you can get from that story, Muslims are a little nervous. Right? There are Hindus who believe that they should be completely dominant, that Muslims would just be like a second-class group, and even people like Gandhi who believe in a kind of equality, who believe in tolerance, that India is for all Indians, whatever their religion. Muslims aren't sure if they can accept that. They're afraid of what will happen to them in an India dominated by Hindus. And India, it is clear, when it does become independent, will become a democracy. And don't get me wrong, I love democracies, but one problem is if you're a minority in a democracy, you're afraid that the majority will be able to dominate you and oppress you legally because they can just outvote you, right? And that's how many Muslims feel. Many Muslims are afraid that in a Hindu-dominated free India, it will be a democracy, and they will simply be oppressed by voting, by ballots. So Muslims will form what's called the Muslim League and push for an independent, separate state. And so thus nationalism will fail to overcome religious, or what they say in India, communal ties. So it's going to be divided. So when India does obtain independence in 1947, it will not gain independence as a single country, but independence as India, West Pakistan, and East Pakistan. Later on, East and West Pakistan are united as one government, but later on, East Pakistan will break off and become Bangladesh. So whereas Gandhi and others had a vision of a single unified India, it will end up being divided by religion, right? With essentially two Muslim states being established out of old India and one Hindu state, which we now call India.